The wind cut sideways across the Wyoming flatland, dragging dust over the porch steps where Ruthie stood clutching her father's coat sleeve. Wyatt lifted his fist and knocked 3 times against the weathered door, harder than he meant to, because his hands were shaking and he needed them to stop. Boots creaked inside. A bolt slid back. The door opened only a crack, enough for one green eye and a shotgun barrel to show themselves. Wyatt Coleman opened his mouth to explain himself, to say the words he had rehearsed the whole ride over, but before a single one left his throat, his 6-year-old daughter ducked under his arm and looked straight up at the woman with the gun. "I heard you need a husband," Ruthie said, plain as rain. "My daddy's lonely too." The woman's green eye went wide. The shotgun barrel dropped an inch. Clara Whitfield stood in the doorway with her jaw tight, sizing up the man who'd ridden onto her land uninvited. The Whitfield ranch had been living on borrowed time since her husband Daniel passed 2 winters back, and every week another rancher rode by with an offer to buy her out cheap, dress it up as kindness. She'd learned to keep the shotgun close, and the door half shut for men like that. But this one didn't look like the others. His coat was patched at the elbow, his boots were caked in mud from the long ride, and the little girl gripping his hand was staring up at Clara like she already knew how the whole thing would end. "I don't know what you heard, ma'am," Wyatt said, "and I don't know who's been talking around town, but I didn't come here to buy your land, and I didn't come here looking for charity either. My name's Wyatt Coleman. I run cattle 2 valleys over, what's left of them anyway, and my daughter here has decided we're short a mother in our house the same way you're short a husband in yours." Clara's eyes cut to Ruthie, who hadn't so much as blinked. Then back to Wyatt. "That's a hell of an introduction," Clara said. "I know it," Wyatt admitted. "I rehearsed something better on the ride over." Lost it the second the door opened. For a long moment neither of them said anything, and the wind kept working at the dust between them, and Ruthie kept holding her father's hand like she was the only thing keeping him upright. Clara finally lowered the shotgun the rest of the way, though she didn't step back from the door. "Where'd you hear I needed a husband?" she asked. "Grange, at the feed store," Wyatt said. "Said your hired hands quit after the bank came around asking questions. Said you were running 400 head with nobody but yourself and a boy of 15. "Grange talks too much," Clara said. "Man's not wrong though, is he?" Wyatt said, and something in his voice wasn't smug, just tired, the same tired Clara heard in her own voice most mornings now. She studied him a while longer. There was nothing about him that matched the pity she usually saw in men's faces when they looked at a widow running a ranch alone, and there was nothing about him that matched the greed either. He looked like a man who'd been knocked down enough times that he'd stopped pretending it didn't hurt. "I'm not looking for a husband," Clara said finally. "Grange got that wrong same as he gets most things wrong. I'm looking for hands who'll work an honest day and not steal from me by Friday." "I can work," Wyatt said. "My girl can too, small as she is. She's got more grit than most grown men I've hired." Ruthie nodded so hard her braid bounced. Clara looked down at her, and something in the girl's face, some open, fearless hope, cracked a door in Clara that she'd kept bolted since the funeral. She didn't like how easily it opened. "1 week," Clara said. "You work 1 week, room in the bunkhouse, meals at my table, and if you're worth keeping past that we talk about wages. That's all I'm offering. Nothing else." "That's more than fair," Wyatt said. Ruthie tugged his sleeve. "Told you she'd say yes," she whispered, loud enough for Clara to hear anyway. Clara almost smiled. "Almost. Don't get used to this," she told the girl, stepping back to let the door swing wider. "And don't call this a courtship. It's a job." "Yes, ma'am," Ruthie said, already skipping past her into the yard like she'd lived there her whole life, and Clara stood watching her go with an ache in her chest she hadn't let herself feel in 2 years, while behind her Wyatt Coleman led his horse toward the barn without being told which way to go, like some part of him already knew this place or wanted to. That first night, after Ruthie had fallen asleep on a cot in the corner of the bunkhouse, and Sam had gone quiet over his own bedroll, Wyatt sat outside on an overturned bucket and looked up at a sky thick with more stars than he'd seen in months of drifting between towns that didn't want him. He thought about the promise he'd made his wife in her last week, that he'd find Ruthie a home with walls that didn't shift under them every few months, a table that stayed in one place long enough to gather dust. He hadn't known, riding out of Cheyenne with nothing but a horse and a debt he couldn't outrun, that the promise would lead him to a widow's porch and a shotgun and a 6-year-old bold enough to say out loud what he'd been too proud to admit even to himself. He was tired of being lonely. He just hadn't found the words for it until his daughter found them for him. Inside the house, Clara sat a long while at her kitchen table with Daniel's old ledger open in front of her, the columns of debts and small mercies she'd been tracking alone for 2 years, and for the first time in a long while she didn't feel like the only pair of hands holding the whole operation up. It scared her more than she wanted to admit. She'd built her grief into a kind of armor, and some stubborn, unguarded corner of her worried that letting a stranger and his daughter into the house was the first crack in it. The first morning Wyatt showed up before sunrise, Already mending a fence line Clara hadn't mentioned needed mending. She watched him from the kitchen window with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands, telling herself she was only checking whether he'd actually work or whether he'd talk a good line and then disappear by noon like the last 2 hands she'd hired. He didn't disappear by noon. He didn't disappear by dusk either. By the end of that first day, he'd fixed the fence, cleared a clogged trough, and pulled a calf out of a ravine it had wandered into, all without asking Clara a single question about how she wanted things done, which she found she both resented and appreciated in equal measure. Ruthie, for her part, attached herself to the ranch like she'd been born to it. She followed the 15-year-old hired boy, Sam, around the barn asking him 100 questions an hour, and by the second evening she'd talked her way into feeding the chickens every morning, a chore Clara hadn't asked anyone to do and hadn't had time to do herself in weeks. "You didn't have to let her do that," Wyatt said one evening, watching his daughter chase a hen across the yard with the kind of joy that only a person who hadn't had much joy lately could produce. "She wanted to," Clara said. Didn't seem right to tell her no. Wyatt looked at Clara a long moment, the kind of look that made her want to find something else to do with her hands. "You're not what Grange made you sound like," he said. "What did he make me sound like?" Clara asked, though she suspected she knew. "Bitter," Wyatt said. "Hard. Said you ran off 2 hands inside a month for looking at you wrong." "I ran off 2 hands for stealing feed and selling it in town," Clara said. "Grange forgets that part." "Figured as much," Wyatt said, and went back to coiling the rope in his hands. It was Sam who told her, later that week, that Silas Boone had been asking around about the Whitfield ranch again, asking specifically whether Clara had hired new men, asking in a tone that made Sam uneasy, though he couldn't say exactly why. Clara had heard Boone's name enough times in the last 2 years to feel her stomach tighten every time it came up. He'd offered to buy her land twice already, both times right after some new trouble had landed on her doorstep, a fever that took half her herd, a bad note at the bank that appeared out of nowhere. She'd never been able to prove Boone had a hand in either, but she'd never quite believed the timing was innocent either. "I don't like that man asking about my ranch," Clara told Wyatt that night, the two of them standing at the porch rail after Ruthie had gone to sleep. "You know him," Wyatt said. "Not a question. Everybody around here knows Silas Boone," Clara said. "He's the reason half the small outfits in this valley sold out for less than they were worth. He's patient. He waits for trouble, and when trouble comes he's there with an offer before the dust settles." "And you think he's the one bringing the trouble," Wyatt said. "I think it's a strange kind of luck that keeps landing on my side of the fence," Clara said. Wyatt didn't answer right away. He looked out over the dark pasture, the cattle shapes barely visible against the tree line, and something in his jaw tightened in a way Clara hadn't seen before. "Let him try something while I'm here," Wyatt said quietly, and Clara didn't ask what he meant by it, though the words settled into her chest and stayed there, warmer than she wanted to admit. By the end of the second week, word had gotten around town that Clara Whitfield had taken on a new hand, and the reactions split the way most things in a small valley did, along lines of who owed what to whom. Old Mrs. Hargrove stopped Clara outside the church to say she was glad to see the ranch wasn't going quiet like everyone feared, and the Delaney boys tipped their hats to Wyatt at the feed store with the easy respect ranchmen gave other ranchmen who knew how to handle a rope. But Grange, behind his counter, kept asking pointed questions about where exactly Wyatt Coleman had come from and why a man with a young daughter and no wife would drift into a valley with nothing to his name. And Clara noticed those questions had a way of finding their way back to Silas Boone before the week was out. She didn't like it, the way Boone's name kept threading itself through every piece of gossip that reached her porch. But she told herself it was nothing more than a small town's appetite for talk, and she went back to teaching Wyatt the particular rhythms of her land, which pastures flooded first in spring, which fence lines needed watching after a hard freeze, and found that he learned it all faster than any hand she'd hired before him, as though he were building a map of the place in his mind, that he intended to keep. Sometimes, riding the fence line together in the last light of afternoon, she caught herself pointing out things she hadn't spoken of to anyone since Daniel, the bend in the creek where the best trout hid, the ridge where her grandfather had once run mustangs before the war took the land from her family and gave it back a generation later. And each time she offered up one of those small buried pieces of herself, Wyatt listened like it mattered, which was, she was beginning to realize, a rarer thing in a man than she'd let herself remember. The storm rolled in on the 9th day, faster than anyone expected, black clouds swallowing the ridge before the herd could be moved to the low pasture. Wyatt was the first one in the saddle, shouting for Sam to circle the east side while he and Clara pushed the cattle west toward the creek shelter. Ruthie left behind at the house with strict instructions to stay inside and keep the lamp burning. Rain came down sideways within the hour, the kind of storm that turned solid ground to mud and made every shape at the edge of the lantern light look like a threat. Clara's horse spooked twice, and both times it was Wyatt who came up alongside her, steadying the reins, shouting instructions over the wind that she was too grateful to resent. By the time the last of the herd was pushed into the creek shelter, both of them were soaked through and shaking, and Clara found herself laughing, actually laughing, at the absurdity of it, mud in her hair and thunder cracking overhead. "You're smiling," Wyatt said, water running off his hat brim. "Don't get used to it," Clara said, though she was still smiling when she said it. They rode back to the house together in the last of the storm, and when they came through the door soaked and half frozen, Ruthie was waiting with towels she'd warmed by the fire, and dinner already laid out though it had gone cold twice over from waiting. Sam joined them a few minutes later, and the four of them, plus Sam, sat around her table eating a meal that had gone lukewarm and tasted better to her than any meal had in 2 years. "I could get used to this," Wyatt said quietly later, after Ruthie had fallen asleep at the table and Sam had gone back to the bunkhouse, leaving just the two of them by the fire. "Used to what?" Clara asked, though she already knew. "This," Wyatt said. "The house full. The work hard but shared. Somebody laughing at my jokes even when they're not funny." "Your jokes aren't funny," Clara agreed, and Wyatt laughed, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Clara let herself sit in the quiet warmth of a house that didn't feel empty, didn't feel like something she was only barely holding together by herself. The storm had passed. The herd was safe. Boone hadn't shown his face in over a week, and the bank hadn't sent another letter, and for one evening it was possible to believe that the worst of it, whatever the worst of it had been, was already behind them, and that what lay ahead was only this, warm firelight and shared work, and a little girl asleep with her head on the table, and a man across from her who made her feel, for the first time in 2 years, like she wasn't carrying the weight of the ranch alone. In the weeks that followed, the rhythm of the ranch settled into something Clara hadn't realized she'd been missing. Mornings that started with Ruthie's chatter over the chicken coop, afternoons of steady work that no longer felt endless because there were 2 sets of hands to share it, evenings where the kitchen stayed warm past dark because there were more mouths at the table and more reasons to linger over coffee. Sam started whistling while he worked, something he hadn't done since before Daniel died, and Clara caught herself, more than once, humming along without noticing she'd started. Wyatt built Ruthie a small hutch for the chickens near the porch so she wouldn't have to cross the whole yard each morning. And one evening Clara found her sitting on the porch steps sketching the hutch in charcoal on a scrap of paper, adding little flowers around the edges that had no business growing in Wyoming in October. Clara sat down beside her without meaning to, and Ruthie handed her the charcoal without a word, and the two of them sat there adding flowers to an imaginary garden until the light went and Wyatt called them both in for supper, and Clara realized, walking back toward the house with a child's small warm hand in hers, that she had stopped counting the days until the week was up. The letter came 4 days later, delivered not by the usual writer but by Silas Boone himself, who rode up the drive in a clean black coat that had never seen a day of ranch work and dismounted like he already owned the ground he was standing on. "Morning, Clara," Boone said, tipping his hat with a courtesy that had always struck her as more insult than manners. "State your business, Boone," Clara said, wiping her hands on her apron as she came down the porch steps. Boone held out an envelope, thick and official, the bank seal pressed into the wax. "Your note's being called," he said. "Full balance due in 30 days. I'm told the banks had concerns about the ranch's management, given the recent," he paused, staffing changes. Clara's hands went cold around the envelope before she'd even opened it. 30 days, she said. "We had until spring." "Circumstances changed," Boone said, his eyes flicking briefly to Wyatt, who'd come around the side of the barn at the sound of a stranger's voice. "Word is you took on a hired man with no references, no history anyone in town can vouch for. Bank doesn't like uncertainty, Clara. Bank likes to know who's holding the reins on an outfit they've got money in. You did this," Clara said, the words coming out low, and even though her whole body wanted to shake. "You went to the bank and put doubts in their ear." "I did nothing but ask a few honest questions," Boone said. "Same as anyone would, seeing a widow taken a drifter with a young girl and no papers to speak of. Man could be anybody, Clara. Could be running from something. Wouldn't be the first outlaw to hide out playing rancher." Wyatt's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, and Clara noticed the silence, noticed it land strange against Boone's accusation, and for one cold second she felt the ground shift beneath her, a question she hadn't let herself ask rising up before she could stop it. "You have 30 days, Boone said, swinging back up into his saddle. "I'd hate to see this place go to auction, Clara. My offer still stands, same as always. Fair price, quick close, no shame in it." "There'd be shame in selling to you," Clara said, and Boone only smiled, unbothered, and rode back down the drive the way he'd come. Clara stood in the yard holding the envelope like it might catch fire, and when she finally turned to look at Wyatt, she found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between guilt and grief, and the question she'd tried to swallow came out anyway. "Is there something you haven't told me, Wyatt?" she asked. Sam came around the corner of the barn just then, having caught the tail end of Boone's visit from a distance, And seeing Clara's face, he quietly took the horses without a word and led them away, leaving the two of them alone in the yard with the letter and the question hanging between them. Ruthie, thankfully, was still down at the creek with a fishing line Wyatt had cut her from an old bit of rope, too far off to hear any of it, and some small mercy in that let Clara breathe long enough to wait for his answer instead of walking away. Wyatt didn't answer right away, and the silence stretched long enough that Clara felt something in her chest go hollow, bracing for whatever truth was about to walk through the door behind Boone's threat. "There's nothing criminal, if that's what you're asking," Wyatt finally said. "But there's a debt. Mine, not yours, not anything I meant to bring onto your land. My wife's medical bills, before she passed, ran higher than I could pay, and I've been sending what I can back to a bank in Cheyenne every month since, which is most of why I showed up here with nothing but a horse and a daughter and the shirt on my back." Boone must have wired around asking questions and found the paper trail. "It's not a secret I was hiding from you, Clara. It's just not something I found the right moment to say." Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "That's not what I feared you'd say," she admitted. "What did you fear?" Wyatt asked. "That you were running from something worse," Clara said. "That taking you and put Ruthie and Sam and this whole place in danger somehow. The only danger I've brought is a man in a black coat with a grudge against anybody who won't sell him their land," Wyatt said, and Clara almost smiled despite everything. 30 days isn't enough to raise what the bank wants," Clara said, sitting down hard on the porch steps, the envelope still in her hand. "I've got maybe half the herd worth selling at a fair price, and even that wouldn't cover it without gutting the ranch down to nothing." "Sell the west parcel," Wyatt said. "Not the grazing land, the old timber lot past the ridge your husband never used. It won't cover all of it, but it'll buy time, and time's worth more than land you're not using anyway." "That land's been in Daniel's family 30 years, Clara said. "And it's doing you no good sitting there unused while the rest of the ranch goes under," Wyatt said gently. "Sometimes holding on to everything costs you everything." It took 2 more days of arguing with herself before Clara rode into town and found a buyer for the timber lot, a lumber outfit from the county seat that had been asking about it for years and paid a fair price without any of Boone's games attached to it. It wasn't enough to clear the note entirely, but it bought breathing room, and for the first time since Boone's visit, Clara let herself believe the ranch might survive this after all. If you have been enjoying Clara and Wyatt's story so far, consider subscribing. There are many more tales like this one waiting for you. Clara had almost let herself sleep easy again. She'd walked the timber lot one last time before the lumber crew came to survey it, running her hand along bark her late husband had once leaned against, and had allowed herself a quiet cry that felt less like grief and more like closing a door gently instead of having it torn off its hinges. Wyatt had waited for her at the tree line without saying anything, letting her have the moment, and when she was ready they'd ridden back together in a silence that felt, for once, like peace instead of dread. But breathing room was all it was, because 3 nights after the timber sale closed, someone cut the fence along the north pasture, and by morning 40 head of Clara's cattle were scattered across 2 miles of open range, and the note in the mud near the cut wire, weighted down with a stone, bore no signature at all, only 4 words that told her everything she needed to know. Sell now or lose more. It took the better part of 2 days to gather the scattered herd, riding the ridgelines and the creek bottoms in a cold that cut through every layer Clara owned, and by the time the last stray was pushed back through the mended fence, she was too tired to feel anything but a low, steady anger that had replaced whatever fear Boone had meant to put in her. Wyatt was the one who found the boot prints near the cut fence, 3 sets, none of them matching Sam's boots or his own, and one of them pressed deep into the mud beside a cigarette stub of a brand sold only at one store in the county, the same store where Silas Boone bought his tobacco every week without fail. "That's not proof enough to take to a sheriff," Clara said, turning the cigarette stub over in her fingers. "No," Wyatt agreed, "but it's proof enough for a different kind of conversation." They rode into town together the next morning, Clara and Wyatt both, and found Boone taking his coffee on the porch of the hotel like a man without a worry in the world. Clara laid the note on the table in front of him, the 4 words facing up, and watched his face for any flicker of surprise and found none. "Careless men leave notes," Clara said. "Careless men also buy the same tobacco every week from the same store, and don't think anybody notices the boot prints they leave behind." Boone's smile thinned, but didn't disappear. "That's a serious accusation, Clara, with no proof behind it." "It's proof enough that I've already told 3 ranchers in this valley what I found," Clara said, which was true. She'd stopped at the Hargrove place and the Delaney place on the ride in, and both families had stories of their own about strange bad luck arriving right before a generous offer from Boone. "Funny thing about a valley this small," Clara went on. "Everybody's been too scared to compare notes till now." For the first time since she'd known him, Clara watched Silas Boone's composure crack, just slightly, just enough to see the man underneath the clean black coat, And she knew before he said another word that his campaign against her, against all of them, was finished, because a man like Boone only thrived on fear and silence, and both had just run out. The bank, when it heard the same stories from 3 separate ranchers within a week, quietly extended Clara's note without further explanation, and Boone left the valley before the month was out, his offer withdrawn, his reputation gone with him. The Hargroves and the Delaney's came by that spring with a wagon of fence posts and 2 extra hands for a full week. Unasked, the kind of debt a valley pays back when it remembers who stood up first. And Clara found herself at the center of a community she'd quietly stopped believing she still belonged to since Daniel's funeral. Sam, for his part, stopped talking about leaving for railroad work come summer, and started asking Wyatt instead about breaking horses properly, like a boy who'd decided he had a reason to stay too. Wyatt stayed on past his first week, past his first month, and by the time the first snow came to dust the ridge line, he wasn't sleeping in the bunkhouse anymore, and Ruthie had stopped asking Clara when she'd be her real mother, because somewhere in the long, unremarkable business of ordinary days, fixing fences and calving in spring and Sunday dinners that ran too long, it had simply become true without either of them announcing it. Clara stood on the porch one evening in early winter, watching Wyatt teach Ruthie how to read the weather in the shape of the clouds, and she thought about the note that had once threatened everything she had, and how it had been Ruthie's small, honest voice on this same porch months before that had cracked open a door Clara thought she'd bolted shut for good. Somewhere behind her, inside the house, the ledger she used to pore over alone at midnight now sat closed most evenings, because there were 2 of them keeping the numbers straight, and because the weight of a ranch, she'd learned, was never meant to be carried by one set of hands, no matter how strong. She thought of Daniel sometimes still, in the quiet moments, and found the thought no longer came with the same hollow ache it once had, only a kind of gratitude that the life she'd built with him had left room enough for another one to grow up through the cracks. "I heard you need a husband," the girl had said, plain as rain, and Clara had spent months telling herself it wasn't true, that she needed hands and a fence mended and a banknote paid, nothing more. But watching Wyatt lift his daughter onto his shoulders so she could see the storm clouds rolling in from the west, Clara finally let herself admit that the girl had been right from the very first knock at the door, and that some of the truest things in this life arrive not through careful plans, but through a child's fearless honesty, spoken plain on a cold porch, to a stranger who turned out not to be a stranger at all.